Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming today. It's a real honor for me to introduce our speaker this morning. Dr. Chuck Swerdlow is here, and I was thinking about what to say, and he wants me to keep this short, but I just want to make a couple comments about him. There are a few people that you'll meet relatively for a short time, but they'll have an oversized impact on your career and your life. And the fellows, it's a real treat for Dr. Swerdlow to be here, so make use of it. He's one of those people. He has had probably hardly anybody else that has had more to contribute to the way that our modern era defibrillator functions today. He has several patents in the defibrillation and in the understanding of safety issues associated with defibrillators. And he has used his considerable superpowers, along with our own Dr. Hauser, to put patient safety first and push back against industry when necessary to keep device safety and patient safety at the forefront. His background is in physics. He has a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Stanford. He went to medical school at the Harvard MIT Health Sciences and Technology program. And he'll tell you he learned to take care of patients in his residency at the UCLA Harbor General Hospital. And he did his cardiology and EP training at Stanford University, where he spent many years. And currently, he practices EP at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles. And a couple just other things about him. He'll tell you that he hails from the land of celebrities, but really in EP, he is a true celebrity. and but a couple of things about him, it's important to understand he's truly a lifelong learner. And as he comes to institutions like ours, not only is he looking to impart his knowledge, but also learn from us. And we consider him a true expert in the field, even though he wouldn't consider himself one. So it's a pleasure to introduce Dr. Swerdlow this morning for our talk.
Well, Jay, thank you for that gracious and heartfelt introduction. Whenever I hear a talk about history at 7 in the morning, the first thing I do is this. But I want to be clear that this is not a talk about history. And I want to just tell you how this is a talk more about what we can learn about how to approach engineering and scientific challenges and how the history of defibrillation, which is a field I've worked in for 30 years, relates to broader trends in science, technology, and society, and whether I picked this topic on a whim. When Dr. Hauser heard that I was going to be visiting at Mayo Clinic for several days, he said, "Well, can you stop by and visit with us?" First, I said, "I'd love to. I've never seen Minneapolis Heart." And he said, "By the way, you're giving grand rounds." And I'm not really a grand round speaker. I looked at my list of talks, because when someone's invited to give grand rounds at a leading institution, there's my confession. You generally want to bring something you've polished a half dozen times, so you give a comprehensive talk and seem like you're suitably impressive. But I realized that my talks, except for EP fellow level talks, were all sufficiently technical that by 7:15 the snoring would be deafening. So I'm really not an expert on this, but I learned a lot reading about it, and I'm more than happy to take your input or tomatoes. And so let's get started. So I think the first step in research in defibrillation really occurred at the very end of the 19th century. And Provost and Batelli wrote what is generally considered both a landmark paper and by me at least, a very difficult paper to read because it's so poorly written. And they put electrodes in the mouth and rectums of small animals. Exactly why is not clear. They learned that they were able to induce ventricular fibrillation by discharging high voltage capacitors at but relatively low voltages. And then they realized if they delivered really strong shocks that they would be able to stop this life-threatening arrhythmia. And of course, this was enabled by the fact that shortly before this, the electrocardiogram had been invented, so they could actually make some recordings. And so they discovered really the three key things that we understand today about defibrillation, although they didn't really phrase it this way. First, they learned that, that weak electric shocks would induce VF if they were timed right, but it took a much stronger shock to defibrillate animals. They recognized also that sometimes they gave a strong shock and it worked, and sometimes it didn't. This exact same shock strength. And this was something that was not understood for, another 80 or 90 years. And finally, nearly all their animals died of what they called respiratory paralysis. And this is because if you give, 3 or 4,000 volts internally to a small animal, you're going to kill it. And and we would call that, but we're quite confident, I'm quite confident what they were looking at is that they were correct. They did stop the fibrillation, and we would call this pulseless electrical activity, PEA, right? So although they identified nearly all these implicitly, they had no clue what they were doing. Didn't recognize that, and they wrote a paper that I have read several times, and I can sympathize with Carl Wiggers, a great American cardiac physiologist, who decided he wasn't going to relook at their claims because he said the idea seemed so fantastic. I read their report in a biased and unfriendly frame of mind, concluded their experimental evidence fell short. I should have considered the possibility the work might have been presented badly. Well, as a section editor in a journal, though, I think this reminds us of two things. One, not just the importance which our teachers have all taught us since high school of communicating your ideas clearly, but that when you review papers, and I assume many of you review papers in your field, that you don't reject a paper just because it's poorly written. If the subject matter is novel, if the authors are struggling with a new concept, I always have considered it my role as a reviewer and now section editor to give these folks a different perspective on how to help them clarify it if there's a chance it might work out. So in the U.S., however, the work on defibrillation did not begin with efforts to prevent sudden cardiac death. Instead, it began as a spin-off of an innovation born from a crisis in the electric power industry. And as the United States was electrified in the first decades of the 20th century, being a power line worker was the most dangerous job in America, more than bridge building and working on skyscrapers without, without safety lines. And the power companies funded research into the mechanisms of what they called electrocution, that is, death from high voltage, high current electricity that was in the AC lines. And by 1930, the Hopkins group had determined that, in fact, people were dying of fibrillation, and they had experiments where they would give shocks to animals. And I forget exactly where, but similar to Vitellian, and sometimes open-chested. And the animals would die if they gave a shock of a certain type, and they were sorting that out. And then, on a whim, they gave a second shock when the animal was in VF. They call this a counter shock. I don't know, some of you may be old enough to have heard this term for defibrillation, because they had given one shock, and then they were now given a second shock, the counter shock, and they realized that that could terminate VF. So they were working with alternating current because that's what power lines carry. And they managed to defibrillate an animal with power lines, with AC current. And so this began a misguided 30 years scientific effort in the United States on AC defibrillation, which was a terrible idea. And Dr. Hauser this morning on the way in asked me if I was going to talk about it in detail. I said, no, you have to choose what you're going to talk about. And I think, though, it is important to understand that because that's what they had, that's the tool they had. And what's even more interesting is if you read the original paper from, I don't think I cited it for you here, but the original paper from Hopkins by Cohenhoven, the first reference in it is Batelli's paper. I mean, they knew about this work 30 years ago. They just ignored that fact. So on the other hand, Batelli had a graduate student named Lena Stern. Lena Stern was a brilliant physiologist. She desperately wanted to get a job at a major Western European university, and she was turned down everywhere because she was a woman. I mean, U.S., Western Europe. And so she returned to her native Moscow, became a chair of physiology at Moscow University. And a decade later, she encouraged her, because the Soviet Union was the only place where women were treated with the same egalitarian lack of resources as the people in the middle of as the men in the middle of what was then the Civil War. But she encouraged her student Noam Gurevich to study defibrillation. And she suggested, because Batelli had studied DC, they looked both at BC, and the Americans were using AC, and said, look at that and come up with something practical that we can use to resuscitate people, or as the Russians say, reanimate people. Now, a lot of Gurevich's work is difficult to find for reasons we can talk about later, but mostly related to information transfer in the Stalin era, and especially people who fell out of favor in what happened to any of their work. But that comes later. But it's best I can tell, from 1933 to 39, he did, when he published his PhD thesis which I have cited at the bottom left, he completely debunked AC defibrillation as dangerous, unreliable, and had a lot of post-shock PEA. He had the insight of saying, we're only going to use transthoracic defibrillation because I want to be able to defibrillate patients from an ambulance, and he started that. He recognized that he could change the defibrillation waveform by putting an inductor in the circuit, and I'm going to come to that in a minute, and proceeded then to empirically test the various forms of defibrillation, what we call waveforms, that is the time course of the discharges from the capacitor, until he found one that he thought was best. He demonstrated, even in the 1940s, the superiority of what we use today biphasic waveforms, but they were slightly harder to instrument, although not very much. But there was a break in defibrillation research then for several reasons. The first is that there was no research on medical work in the Soviet Union during the Second World War. It was a desperate time. And then secondly, we will see various purges of scientists happened after the war that people are more concerned with staying alive than getting their grants funded. But in 1953, he started a company to manufacture commercial external defibrillators. And by the late 1950s, Moscow ambulances were rolling around with functioning DC defibrillators. And shortly after that, they were biphasic waveform defibrillators. And so in my mind, there is no one who has contributed more to the history of defibrillation, and at least in this country, maybe less recognized than Noam Gurevich. And he did a lot of other things, but we have a number of things to talk about what we can learn here. But he really was the first person to understand that the term we use, waveform, which I use to mean the temporal pattern of how strong the shock is, that we call that the amplitude, and you measure that by voltage or current. And he was able to think this way because instead of just discharging the capacitor and watching the animal jump, he had an oscilloscope, and he could, then it was not very difficult. Oscilloscopes had been around for, certainly since the, commercial ones since the 20s. And he could observe the waveform, and then he could modify it based on the pattern of, pattern of the waveform. So I do want to say a little bit about the technology we put in defibrillators, and you can either tune this stuff out or just, see if any of it works for you. So I want to say just, what are the key components? Well, every defibrillator we use stores electricity in a short-term storage unit, a short-term storage element called a capacitor, which is two metal plates you learned in high school separated by a insulator. They don't exactly look like this because they're wrapped to conserve space, but that's the general idea. And the key things are that it's inefficient to store energy in an electrical circuit at high voltage, and especially DC electricity. And in fact, you can't store AC electricity, right? It's always being transmitted. Um, uh, so storing DC electricity is inefficient. Storing chemical potential energy in batteries, or just connecting it to wall power, and getting it directly off the, whatever your source of power is, and it is, easy. And so, you store the energy long term in these efficient storage places, and when you need to deliver the shock, you charge the capacitor up to a high voltage. So capacitors store energy in electric fields. The way we rate a capacitor is how much charge it takes to store it to a certain voltage. So small capacitors get charged very quickly, and large capacitors will accept a lot of voltage, a lot of charge. The reason we care in this talk, and I'm seemingly wasting your time on this, is that the size of a capacitor is one of the two components that determines how long it takes when you turn off the input into this capacitor to discharge its stored energy. Now, capacitors, you can think of them, and if there are engineers in the audience, I apologize, but I'm going to oversimplify this, have this tendency to resist changes in voltage. So if you stop charging it, it's going to discharge, but it does it over a period of time. And that time is determined, we call it, is an exponential decay, and it's determined by two things: what the electrical impedance or resistance is for practical purposes in this circuit, in the output circuit, and how big the capacitance is. So big capacitors discharge slower, small capacitors discharge faster. We will see that for the first 70 years of defibrillation work, there was no practical way to make a high voltage, large enough capacitor for a long time constant that you really wanted for defibrillation. And this is why Gurevich had the idea of adding an inductor to the circuit. Now, a couple other things just about pure capacitor systems. The waveforms we use in defibrillators are not discharged forever. They're discharged, and then there's a timing circuit that shuts them off. We call that truncation. The other important point, though, that I'm going to come back to later is that this time constant is an implicit clock. In other words, if you measure how long it takes the voltage to drop to a certain level, that is a measure of time, and you can use that as a clock. And so this is what, a typical older oil-filled paper capacitor can look like. And you probably can't read it from the back of the room, but for example, this says, I pulled it off the internet, 2,000 volts, 4 microfarads. That's a very small capacitor. So what is an inductor and how does that change things? Well, inductors are circuit elements that instead of storing electricity in electric fields like capacitors, they store energy in magnetic fields. And instead of resisting changes in current, in voltage, they resist changes in current. So what does that mean? That means if you discharge the capacitor, and it's a very small capacitor, you will be out, it will have discharged all its energy very quickly. And this is why you need huge voltages with small capacitors to defibrillate. If, on the other hand, you put an inductor in the circuit, as the current flowing out of the capacitor stops, the inductor has stored energy in the magnetic field, and that comes out, and the delivery of current to the body becomes much slower. And then we can see by altering the amount of inductance, you get different shapes of waveforms. And this is how Gurvich generated what we call a biphasic waveform, one that goes positive and negative. Now, this was great for external defibrillators, and anyone old enough to have gone to a museum or actually used one of the early external defibrillators and can attest to the fact they were heavy. They were heavy because old inductors, particularly older ones, require big blocks of iron because that's the ferromagnetic core they were using in those days to have an adequate inductor. And it wasn't very practical, of course, when we come to implantable devices, but it enabled the ability to make battery-powered external defibrillators. Before we move on, I want to say a few things about the fate of Lena Stern. During the Second World War, the Soviet government asked her to join an anti-fascist Jewish association because she was Jewish, and she successfully raised millions of dollars for Soviet war effort from American Jews. After the war, Stalin accused her and prominent members of other Jewish scientific organizations of espionage in yet a new version of Russian pogroms. Many of them were executed. It is rumored that Stalin kept Stern alive because he was hoping she'd be able to reanimate him. And they were all replaced by politically correct scientists who were chosen to promote socialist science. Western-trained scientists who were once actively recruited were banned. And as a result, Soviet science was crippled for decades. Whether there's a lesson for the 21st century United States there, I'll leave that for you to judge. But at any rate, by association with Stern, as her student, Gurvich lost his position. He had to find a place in sort of a second-rate operation, and his work was really set back huge amounts because he was discredited, and people didn't want to associate with him because, just by association, you could end up dead, right? So in the United States, DC defibrillation arrived because Gurvich had a student, a Czech student, who trained a Hungarian engineer named Berkovits. And during the 1953 revolution in Hungary, he managed to briefly, when the borders were open, he managed to get out. He made his way to the United States and worked for the American Optical Company. But his real love was defibrillation. And he learned that Bernie Lown and Sam Levine at the Peter Bent Brigham were running a coronary care unit, that they were resuscitating post-MI patients from VF with these giant wall plug-in AC defibrillators, which was, from Berkowitz's perspective, barbaric. Exactly how he contacted Lown, I'm not sure, but he did the equivalent, of calling Lown up on the phone and saying, hey, I can build you a DC defibrillator. Lown said, come on down. And he had Gurvich build him a defibrillator. Exactly what kind of FDA approval the original one went through, I'm not entirely sure. But within a year or so, Lown published his first paper on synchronized DC defibrillation or cardioversion, and both atrial and ventricular arrhythmias. And he then, for the next 20-odd years, he worked in this field, systematically airbrushed Berkowitz out of the history books, credit, or any mention in discussing defibrillation. So it is important to, realize that scientific credit, we call this the Lown defibrillator, the Lown waveform. This was all Gurvich's work brought to the United States by Berkowitz, and because refugees could be treated this way, Berkowitz's name was, at least by Lown's efforts, pretty much does not appear at all in the medical literature. Lown, however, in his 1962 JAMA paper, had an interesting observation. At the present time, there is no physiologic basis for predicting a waveform optimal for defibrillation. This is because Lown didn't bother to sit and think. He just grabbed Berkowitz's technology and started using it, right? I mean, I doubt Lown knew hardly anything about defibrillation, but that's a whole other story. But he could write well. Development of an effective instrument, therefore, becomes a tedious trial and error procedure. So nobody is a better example of that than John Schutter. John Schutter was a electrical engineer at the University of Missouri. He got interested in defibrillation, and in the early 60s, this is before before transistors were widely used in electronic equipment, he built a huge setup to do animal testing and defibrillation and analyze waveforms. He had a room full, a wall. There's a museum there of amplifiers. He built a giant linear amplifier, and the key thing about a linear amplifier is if you connect it to the enough AC power, is basically an infinite capacitor. So you can then, if you have a timing circuit, and his problem actually was, in those days, in the early 60s, there were no crystal oscillator clocks or small ones you could, automate the way we have them today in our wristwatches and cell phones, et cetera. And so he didn't have a good way to time the pulses. He could make a pulse that was a square wave or a truncated exponential, but he was never sure exactly when it would start and stop in the timing. And this kind of hampered his work, but he spent 20 years testing various defibrillation waveforms. I don't truly understand. I think one of his, we would read much more. I mean, I've read much Schutter's work. I read it many years ago. I read it several times when I was learning this stuff. It's quite good. I don't think he worked much with physicians, as best I can tell, and so he just was in his own world. But he did this, and in 1964, he published this paper where he observed that that biphasic waveforms were far more forgiving than monophasic waveforms for defibrillation. He forgot about it. He was testing so many waveforms, he couldn't keep them all straight, and he wasn't sure what, and exactly what his priorities were. I don't know. I've never figured this out. But it wasn't until 1981 when he read this paper by cellular electrophysiologist in Washington, D.C., Janice Jones and her husband, that was called Improvement in Defibrillator Waveform Safety Using Biphasic Waveforms. And they were doing microshocks on cell culture, and they showed that the cardiac cells would start contracting a lot quicker after a biphasic shock than a monophasic shock. So Schutter read this, and then he went back and looked at his 20-year-old data, and he said, in addition, a review of some of our own early bidirectional waveform shock showed superiority of biphasic shock. So he had this stuff 20 years earlier. He had done it, and it just didn't register with him. So I want to pause for a second and think about insights gained from taking a second look at your data. Or things you've written, and this happened to me at a very small scale, not this scale, in the last year, but could Shooter have saved himself 20 years of work if he'd actually analyzed his data right? So, you never know exactly what's in your data, but my favorite example of this is my favorite exhibit at the Smithsonian Air and Space Museum in DC, which is this photograph. It's a little one. It's in a back room. You really know where to look for it. Taken by Edwin Hubble in 1923 from the Mount Wilson Observatory of the Andromeda Galaxy. Now, without going too far off the deep end of things I'm interested in the 1920s, there was a big debate about whether the Milky Way was the only galaxy out there, whether there were other ones, and these little things called nebulae were hard to see. But Hubble had an instrument, the most powerful telescope in the country, and he trained it on this part of the sky, and he saw one day, what he thought was a nova or a new star, and they weren't exactly sure. We now know that these are typically the end stages, exploding stars, and we've all heard about the gravitational collapse of stars now, but this was not understood then. But it was very clear that it was known since this at least 15th century that there would be stars that would burn very brightly and then would go out, and then you'd never see them again. So, being a systematic observer, he went back a few weeks later, and sure enough, it was gone as he expected. And and it was on to other things. But he said, well, let me just go back and look again. And there it was. And these things aren't supposed to come and go and come and go. And you can see that he took his original photographic plate, crossed out the N on this guy, and wrote VAR for variable. Now, why does anybody care? Well, it turns out that variable stars, without getting into the physics of light intensity variation in stars, variable stars have periods that vary with their intrinsic brightness. In other words, they're basically not just clocks, but you can use the period of a star to tell how far you're away of it by knowing how bright it is when it's up close, and then saying, oh, it looks this dim far away. And he said, whoa, no one's ever seen a variable star that far, that's that dim. This thing has to be way far away. There is no way that's in our galaxy. And this is how other galaxies were discovered. So it's and there is more than one great story in science about people doing that. So just making sure you actually understand what you have in front of your nose, I think, is a very good lesson. Moving on, while Shooter was busily going through waveforms one at a time, in 1966. Harry Heller, who was chief of medicine at Tel Hashmir Hospital, died suddenly in front of his family at dinner. And his former assistant, Michelle Morawski, had an epiphany. He said, if there was an implantable defibrillator, Heller, my boss could have been saved. A few weeks later, he had lunch with a very famous American pacemaker surgeon. He shared his vision. And Parsonet wrote later, this was never going to work. He said he just couldn't imagine in his mind how they were going to take these gigantic, 100-fold, defibrillators, and making it into what he called an implantable gizmo, right? Vic Parsonet was very famous, very good surgeon. He contributed a lot to technical aspects of pacemaker implantation. But you know, and he was very influential. Murawski, however, ignored him because he was a man on a mission. Heller was very close to him, and for him, developing the defibrillator was personal. It wasn't a research project, and he had overcome. Well, I mean, first of all, you have to understand he was a practicing doctor. At this point, he had no electrophysiology training. He didn't know a thing about bioelectricity. He didn't know anything, as it will be clear, about the effects of shocks on contractility and PEA, and he was clueless about circuitry. But he had a lot of grit, and he had overcome longer existential life odds. He had left Poland as a teenager when his parents elected to stay and were executed by the Nazis. He fled east to the Ukraine, where after that Ukraine was invaded, he fled further east. And then when Jews were persecuted in the Soviet Union after the war, he managed to get his wits about him, get to Israel and go to medical school. And by 1970, he wrote and published what is generally regarded as the first and landmark paper in automatic implantable defibrillation. He came to the United States. He realized he needed the resources of the United States, teamed up with Dr. Maurer and some engineers in Baltimore. Now, there are a few things about this paper. Number one, you ask, why is a breakthrough paper on defibrillation published in the archives? I mean, who even reads this journal, right? This is where people must send their desperation stuff. So I think this happened for one of two reasons. It happened either because the reviewers were all folks like Parsonet or worse, and we're going to come to that in a minute, who lacked vision. And I think for the main cardiology journals that was true, or because if you actually read this paper, and this paper is cited this paper has more citations than you can count. It does report on defibrillation, and that's it. There is nothing implantable or automatic about it. Here is the sensing circuit. It was an external thing on a breadboard, right? Here they are, where they're running the equipment, connected to the animal. So what this was a proof of concept experiment. What did Murawski do? Well, he certainly was not going to design a defibrillator. He didn't know the first thing about it. So, and the engineers he was working with didn't either. So basically what they did is they took Berkowitz's 1966 patent, they copied it. Now, they have exactly the same size capacitor because in those days, there weren't, they had these, they had gone from what Gurvich was using, which was oil-impregnated paper dielectrics to film dielectrics. But the basic problem was these were very small capacitance devices. You could not make a high capacitance, high voltage device. And so that's what Murawski used. But he realized he was going to want to implant this, and the inductors in those days were big blocks of iron. So he just took the inductor out of the circuit. So what does he have now? He has a 2500 volt, very short pulse that he's applying epicardially to dogs. This is the great success of the first paper on implantable defibrillators. What could possibly go wrong? Well, here's the only tracing that he publishes, and we should just examine that. The animal is defibrillated, but just as Provost and Patelli had understood, and Lam would have understood if he'd bothered to, read their work, is that after that, not only do the QRS complexes get tiny, right? I mean, it's not like this hasn't been defibrillated, right? There's asystole, the heart comes back, and you can see the RV pressure tracing, right? There is, I mean, these tiny little QRSs go with these RV pressure tracings. This is just PEA. So this is, 15 or 20 seconds, in a healthy dog, right? Just think about what would have happened if he had tried to do this in myopathic human hearts under anesthesia. You can only imagine, right? So luckily for him, well, we'll come to that in a minute. At the same time, however, Shooter had realized that he could defibrillate with much lower voltages and keep animals and not cause PEA. He didn't have very high voltage capacitors, so he was using very big capacitors. The problem was they required a huge amount of energy because they weren't very high voltage. But by 1970, he had a fully implantable device ready to go. And had device companies been willing to build a defibrillator in the 1970s, implantable defibrillator in the 1970s, and they had their engineers had the slightest clue about how defibrillation worked, there is no question they should have chosen Shooter's design over Murawski's. But Shooter was an engineer working on interesting solutions to this problem, that problem, and Murawski wanted to deliver a clinical tool. What did key opinion leaders say after both Murawski and Shooter published their reports? Basically, that there was no need for this, right? I mean, Bernie Lown, the system represents an imperfect solution in search of a plausible application, and Parsonet basically told, and other experts told the device companies he was an unrealistic dreamer. And at the same time, there's a very famous electrophysiologist whose quotes I don't have, Doug Zipes, who was trying to sell Medtronic on a misguided low voltage device that he thought he could actually make work. And they actually invested a lot of money and gave Doug huge amounts of money on a useless product that was eventually abandoned. But I think this was lucky for Murawski, because had his device been chosen, it would never have passed clinical testing. But he was rescued by the photo flash industry. The photo flash industry was a rage. Photo flash became a rage in the United States in the 1970s. And to do photo flash, you need a high capacity, high voltage capacitor, and you need to make it cheap, right? Because people are going to sell their flash bulbs and they're going to use them. And I realize I'm a little over on time, so I will try and wrap this up in 5 to 8 minutes. Do I have that much time left? 5 to 8 minutes, or okay. With that, he was able to build an implantable defibrillator. And here is their first implantable defibrillator. These are the capacitors, and if you pop, this is a older photo flash capacitor that you can buy in an Army surplus store today. And if you look at it, this is exactly what's in here, right? It's an off-the-shelf photo flash capacitor built by and this whole defibrillator, of course, was built by a startup company named Midrad, because the main manufacturers were either working on the Zipes, cardioverter or something else. But the key point was it's this technology, as well as some battery improvements, that allowed this to happen. You can see there's a lot of off-the-shelf stuff here. By the time we get to the today's defibrillators, the batteries are conformal, and of course they are similar chemistry, but the form factors are very different. The capacitor form factors are, the electronics are way ahead. I'm not going to spend time on details here, but before closing, oh, this didn't work very well. You know what? Let me. This is a mistake, and I apologize. Let me just get rid of these things, and I apologize. You know what? I did this late last night, and I'm sorry. Okay. So I do want to say just two things really quick. The original waveform stuff, to finish the waveform story I began, originally devices used monophasic defibrillation from here to here. Well, it was clear Schroeder had known this years before, right? That biphasic defibrillation was much better. And he had the insight, I think it's pretty obvious, that if you want to just build one capacitor, you can't have this system he had, because he could just generate any arbitrary waveform he wanted to from his wall full of amplifiers. You needed a you needed what we call the leading edge voltage of the second phase, right, to be exactly the same as the trailing edge voltage of the first phase, because the idea is you discharge the capacitor so much, then you flip the polarity on the outputs, and you discharge it in the reverse direction. Okay, not hard to think through. And then you pick an amount of time and throw the switch. Problem was Schroeder didn't have a clock to do this. But as an engineer, he realized that the system time constant of a RC circuit is an implicit clock. And so he said, I'm going to truncate at one system time constant, which means that voltage goes down to 37% of approximately what it started. It's 1 over the e, the base of natural logarithms. And so, but he really was interested in how much the voltage fell before he turned it, before he truncated, as opposed to what the voltage actually was. I have no idea why. He called this term tilt. The idea was how slopey the waveform was. So that would be 63% tilt, but he couldn't calibrate his dials down to 1%. He could calibrate them, put little marks on them to plus minus 5%. So we rounded it to 65% tilt. Why am I saying this? Because there are generations of electrophysiologists, and there are manufacturers today that still put hardware out that's designed to 65% tilt. And the only reason Schroeder did this is that he didn't have an adequate clock to measure the time. And I just want to, we could spend an hour on how the development of clocks has enabled technology throughout history. But just my favorite example, answering an important question that had not been looked at for a long time, was since the time of Aristotle, people wanted to know how much faster did things go when they fell, as they fell. I mean, everybody understood things accelerated, but the rate of acceleration was totally unknown, and nobody could measure it because water clocks and that sort of thing just didn't do the job. But Galileo, who was a musician, realized that if he could roll something down an incline and adjust a series of bells and use his exquisite musical ear to time the as your object was sliding down, it would hit each bell, and every time it hit a bell, he would hear the tone. And if he could move them just certain distance apart, that the bells would come out at equal time, then he could measure the distance and see how much distance was traveled at equal time. And so this was his kludge clock. This was Schroeder's kludge clock. Today we have crystal oscillators. There's no reason that we should do that. For lack of time, I'm not going to discuss this today. I do want to say one of the things that we could have done many years ago is come up with an adequate model of defibrillation, mathematical model. The credit for this belongs to a Minneapolis electrical engineer named Mark Kroll, who, just because of limited time, I'm going to skip my slides on the details of his model, except to say it was extremely simple. It only relied on passive membrane properties, made some very simplistic assumptions. And then amazingly, and I will just say, amazingly, it predicts what we need to know about defibrillation waveforms, if not perfectly, just very well in such a surprising way. There is a wonderful essay by Eugene Wigner, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, written in the mid-60s, called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics and Natural Science. Saying, why is it you can make a model, of stuff that shouldn't obviously work, and yet it does? And then, of course, a lot of models that don't work. This slide, without wasting your time, is a lot of some of my experimental work actually demonstrating and validating weird predictions of Kroll's model. This slide, which I again won't have time to go through in detail in this audience, it's less important, is the point, does any of this matter in 2025? Well, yeah, just to give you an example, in July of this year, a major device manufacturer came out with a field clinical action about the risks of what happens to their devices in part because the way they design the waveforms when the leads get calcified. The first person to blow the whistle on this problem 7 years ago was Dr. Hauser, sitting in the front row, as he has protected us against so many other things. But the point I wanted to make is, what was Kroll's background in defibrillation when he did this? None. What were his references? Well, they went from 1901 to 1932 when he published his first paper in 1993. The point is, anybody could have had these insights, and then going back 30 years, but Kroll didn't. And Kroll's the guy who got there. So, what can we learn to wrap this up? Or what did I learn? Progress in defibrillation was hindered by lack of fundamental understanding at every step. It depended on advances enabling technology. In the West, it was delayed by academic misogyny and key opinion leaders who suppressed thought. In the USSR, it was delayed by xenophobia and anti-Semitism. It did not occur in dominant medical device companies. It highlights the importance of clear scientific writing and reading poorly written papers with an open mind. And it could have been done much faster, decades faster. And I made a list of these things, right? Adding an inductor to the circuit. Anyone after Michael Faraday in 1850 could have done this. Provost and Patelli could have did it, right? Adopting DC defibrillation in the US. It wasn't like they hadn't read Provost and Patelli's papers. It was more, the question is why? Well, they were focused on this industrial problem. And then once the experts understood you could, defibrillate with AC, that was the way to do it. And you weren't, became socially inappropriate to think about DC defibrillation. The biphasic waveform, right? Well, no one had an adequate model of what to do. Why wasn't waveform research guided by a mathematical model? Well, doctors didn't think. That just wasn't their conceptual framework. And then why did it take a decade to commercialize the defibrillator after proof of concept, right? So I do want to just close with a last slide on how we are limited by our conceptual framework. There is a iconic book written in the 1960s that I'm sure most of you have read, and those of you who haven't, I would recommend. Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions. People have criticized this and written about it, but it's important because they've written about it for many years. And the key point is that Kuhn was the first to debunk this gradual progression of trend of knowledge and enlightenment in science. He says people work in a field, whatever that field is, doing the allowed research that works within the framework that people are thinking about things, and whether that is the medieval ages in the Catholic Church, or whether that's AC defibrillation in the United States in the 1930s. All the experts say this is the way it is. If you can't get funding to work on off other types of topics, journal editors who are trained in reviewers, by the experts, say, that's not really what we do here. And so until, there is some, and anomalous results, right, are either considered errors or just misguided or just, one-off anomalies. There's another more recent book that's nowhere as good, but gets at the question of how people's actually change their minds. And Koons, who's a much more intellectual writer, this guy who's a journalist, makes, I think, a very important point, whether we're talking about polarization in America or changing scientific paradigms, that there are fundamental biological reasons that humans don't want to think differently than their peers. And I'm not going to get into all those details, we're out of time, but asking the right questions, asking questions other people haven't asked, as Carl Jung said, is half the solution. It's always good to ask, how is it that the great thinkers of history have been able to ask questions that were, in Galileo's day, heresy, to the church, right? And of course, it begs the question, what insights are we actually missing today? So I apologize for running over, but I will be around here and be happy to answer questions. Silence. Okay, please. Oh, actually, am I supposed to hand this out so that everyone else can?
Well, you stretched my brain power this morning, so thank you for that, and especially since you seem to have put this together last night partially, I really appreciate it.
Well, no, I'm sorry, but you were going to ask it. Good. Thank you for the kind words, and yes.
My question is, as a non-electrophysiologist, are we at the peak of our understanding of how to defibrillate the human heart?
No. Let me backtrack. I'm not. There's a lot I don't understand. There may be a couple of people in the country. There are some people who have better understanding of it than I do. But I don't entirely think so. And I had I had a few slides on this, but very briefly, let's just think about what we might think is a simpler problem, slightly simpler in defibrillation. Bradycardia pacing, okay? I mean, what is the goal of bradycardia pacing? We all know the goal of bradycardia pacing is to take a sodium channel in the resting state and to activate it, right? And then once it's activated, then the energy stored in these cells will do their magic, and chemical energy will be converted to electrical impulses, and the heart's own electrical system will take over and propagate the impulses, right? So the goal is then to trip the voltage sensor on a sodium channel. Now, and then the channel has some conformational changes and that sort of thing. But that doesn't really matter. Once you hit the voltage sensor, it's wired to do all that stuff to like open the channel and tell the little parts to move aside. And flipping the voltage sensor happens at the speed of molecules. Now, no, it's hard to, you can't really measure a sodium channel because we don't have tools to do it adequately. And I skipped through a slide that shows you people's best efforts to look at the speed, but we know that the speed of molecular interactions and solutions is femtoseconds, 10 to the minus 15 seconds. So here's a question. If our goal is to flip switches on sodium channels, why do we deliver a half millisecond bradycardia pacing? What are we doing for the, all this other rest of the time, right? I mean, and it's not because we don't have clocks that can deliver microsecond pulses. We do that with pulse field ablation all the time. The answer is we are charging the capacitor in the membrane around that sodium channel so that you can actually get the voltage in its environment up enough at the voltage sensor. It's like it's embedded in that cell membrane. Now, defibrillation is a lot more complicated because the whole heart is not in a resting state, right? In defibrillation, it's very clear you have to globally affect the entire heart. It's also pretty clear you have to depolarize nearly all of it. Exactly how to do that and whether there are cleverer ways to do that. I think that's right. And then once you depolarized it, you have to remove the excess electricity. Well, let me backtrack. When we do this, to affect the whole heart, you have to do overkill in parts of the heart. And that overkill, that extra charge, turns out, for reasons we get into, to increase the risk of refibrillation. That's why AC defibrillation is, always refibrillate on the hearts, and why very long pulses. And so, exactly how to measure that optimally, I don't know. And yes, we have, and then there are other like basic understanding things like, can we defibrillate? I mean, project I tried to work on with my brother years earlier, many years ago, was can we reduce defibrillation? Painful defibrillation. Defibrillation hurts. Can't we make painless defibrillation? Or at least much less. How do we deliver pulses that don't hurt as much? I would just say I have only a rudimentary understanding of defibrillation, and I think there's still a lot to learn. I don't think this is a done deal. That's a bit, please.
Thank you so much. That was a very excellent talk. One question I have is, what is your thought about machine learning and artificial intelligence and individualizing ICD for specific patients and kind of learning from past shocks and individualizing subsequent therapy zones?
First, an excellent question, an important subject. One I have done some work on, and it's an active area of investigation. You don't want people to blow off your question saying, happy to talk to you about it in detail later. But let me just say, broadly speaking, there are two ways to look at this. Whenever you have a computationally intensive problem, and there's no question that either analytical approaches to this or neural network approaches to what you're talking about is computationally intensive. The computational power in defibrillator is still extremely limited, even without modern defibrillators. So we always have to ask, what can we do in the device? What can we do in a programmer? What needs to be done on a network? And how do they, but that's okay. I mean, and it's not really practical on a moment-to-moment basis, when an arrhythmia arises to, for the device to do that type of analysis, because you can't depend on connectivity. Suppose you have a bad cell phone signal, right? But getting at this issue of, are these really implantable standalone devices, or is all our implanted technology today just a node in a larger medical informatics network, which is, I think, one of the things you might be implying. These are very important questions, big thought. What could we actually do useful with this, as opposed to, I spitball a lot of things, say, well, that sounds cool, but is there any value in that? And so, I always have to come up, where are the value propositions? And there are value propositions there. Exactly how to implement it, how much benefit it would be. But I would go one step further, not just individualizing, but could the collective brain of implantable defibrillators learn from all the other ones? So I mean, on their own. So there's a lot of possibilities, but I think we could spend way too much time on that. All right. I don't want to keep anyone too long, but I'll be around.